Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I want to congratulate QQI on this important statement of strategy. And what I want to do today is talk a little bit about how we look at things, how you look at things, and stress the commonalities of approaches that we have. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is the New England Commission of Higher Education. You see the 6 states in the northeast corner of the U.S. NECHE accredits about 200 institutions in these states: Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, MIT, state universities, community colleges, niche institutions in fields like art and music and engineering and health, liberal arts colleges, and the smallest institution, the Conway School of Landscape Design, which offers a 1-year master's degree in landscape design to 18 students at a time. And NECHE also accredits 12 American-style institutions in other countries. Can we have the next slide, please? So American accreditation is a very decentralized system of higher education. Accreditation traces its roots to 1885 in New England, and that is in contrast to 1980, which is the year that the U.S. finally got a separate Department of Education in federal government. So this is, NECHE is a private membership organization, and the decisions are made by a commission that includes representatives from member institutions, plus public members who neither they nor their immediate family have any connection with higher education. So it has a direct connection with the public. It's a self-regulatory system as a membership organization. It's voluntary, but there are real incentives, including access to students for federal financial aid, which in this last year was $235 billion. So it's a significant incentive there. But the most important incentive, I think, and the most fragile, and here we certainly agree with QQI, is that public confidence that an accredited institution is one that the public can trust. And that's a very fragile benefit that we need to rely on and pay close attention to all the time. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a representation of the dual purposes of accreditation in the U.S. One is that public assurance of quality, so that the public knows that an accredited institution is one that they can have confidence in, to attend, to have their son or daughter or their cousin or brother attend. And equally important, as you see in this balanced scale, is that the process itself promotes improvement in the college or university through the self-study, through the standards, through the peer review, and through the decision by the commission. Next slide, please. So in Ireland, you have a national government agency. In the US, we have this membership organization and the triad with the federal government and the state governments. You have a national framework of qualifications, which is fascinating, I think, to Americans. And we just have degree levels, and I've listed the 4 of them here. There's variation within each of them, but we have nothing approaching your national framework of qualifications. You have a developed system of further education. The closest that we have to that is the non-credit work that's offered by community colleges, which a friend of mine calls the college you don't see, because it's less visible. And I'm watching with great interest the development of the education and training boards and the process there. Similarly, your system of apprenticeships is more developed than the US. We have Northeastern University here in the Boston area that has a system of cooperative education where students cycle through work and learning in an organized way in a 5-year bachelor's degree program. And we have the beginning of corporations offering apprenticeships in new fields, most notably cybersecurity. For oversight of private higher education, Ireland has the Learner Protection Fund. NECHE has very stringent financial monitoring of certain private providers and the requirement of teach-out plans where theirs are important. Next slide, please. So, but we have a lot of similarities, and I would list at the top as the most important, that importance of public confidence in higher education through the strategies and work that we do, providing information for learners to make choices on where they want to study, and increased emphasis on work and careers and the future skills requirements, the transfer prior learning, the mobility, the cycling in and out of tertiary education. Both of those have become increasingly important here over time, and I think in Ireland as well. And our partnerships, communications plan strategically, as is reflected in the statement of strategy, and more emphasis on online learning and rethinking the quality. Now that we have experience, and certainly with COVID, we have more experience than we were counting on with online learning, and I think an increasing sophistication about what makes quality in online education. More emphasis on short-term credentials and more visibility for them, and figuring out when we do get to the other side, but something that I think we're both working on now, what has COVID meant to further on higher education, and what have we learned from it? What changes have we made that will endure? So next slide, please. So this is, in some ways, a very short history of accreditation in the US, moving from input to process to outcomes. So in the beginning, using this example here, looking at the library, are there enough books? If you go back several decades in the US, NECHE had a standard telling them, institutions, how many books they had to have in their library, clearly an input standard. And then over time, asking if students are actually using the books. And increasingly looking at outcomes. Are students gaining the skills of information literacy through the books and other resources provided by the institution? And are the faculty well qualified? An input standard. Is the curriculum appropriate? And moving through process to the good teaching, practice and instruction and feedback for students. Now, a huge amount of emphasis in the US is on the outcomes. Are students achieving the learning outcomes of the program and institution? Assessment and making sure that students are achieving those learning outcomes and that the assessment process is fed back into improvement is one of the probably the main emphasis in accreditation today. And next slide, please. What else is of concern here? We are an increasingly diverse society, and so there's a great deal of emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. A friend of mine says diversity is being asked to the dance, and inclusion is being asked to dance. We're concerned here about the decreasing number or percentage of men in higher education. So right now in the US, there are about 3 women in higher education for every 2 men enrolled, and women graduate at a higher rate. I mentioned assessment of learning outcomes, extremely important. Affordability is a concern here, completion rates, and the demographic cliff, which I have called, which means that the number of traditional age students in higher education will decline sharply in about 2026 as a result of lower birth rate during the Great Recession. And whether that enrollment numbers can be made up by increased emphasis on lifelong learning is to be determined. And then finally here, competency-based education, which looks at measures student progress not so much by the amount of time that they have spent or credits that they have earned, but the competencies that they have demonstrated. And that goes back to the emphasis on assessment. That's a real challenge, but it's a fascinating one. Next slide, please. I think one thing that we both have learned is to expect the unexpected. If there's one overarching learning from COVID, I think is that it certainly was unexpected. And I think higher education in Ireland and in the US have shown a great responsive to that. We're not known for changing quickly, but I think in both Ireland and the US, higher education and further education have demonstrated that they can respond and keep the emphasis on the learner and on the partnerships. And next slide, please. And here's something important to all of us. I think here are wolves howling at the moon, and one of them says to his colleague there, my question is, are we making an impact? And I think that's the bottom line for NECHE in the US and for QQI, and I think the strategy does that extremely well. So I thank you, and I congratulate QQI on its statement of strategy.